Hello again. In this lecture, I want to talk about the one thinker who potentially rivals Dante for the range and depth of his influence through his literary work on our thinking about the nature of evil. And that is, as it has to be, John Milton. Milton is arguably the greatest poetic genius of the English language. He's rivaled really only by Shakespeare for his literary import. He was born in 1608 and he died in 1674. So he stretches across the turbulence of the 17th century of England. He was remarkably well educated, even by the elite standards of his time. He took a BA and then an MA at Cambridge, and then spent, after his university time, 6 years in semi-seclusion at his father's country house, reading everything important. And when I say everything, I am not joking. Some people think that Milton may have been the last person alive in Europe to have effectively read every book of import, or almost every book he could find, just before printing made the actual mastery of the entire body of knowledge impossible. But as for languages alone, he not only knew Latin and Greek, of course, and Hebrew, naturally, and French and Italian, of course, but Spanish, Dutch, and Old English as well. He was accomplished in some Chaldean, which is an early version of what happens to be some of the ancient Near Eastern languages that become Aramaic and things like that. And he knew a little bit of Arabic as well. He was not just a literary figure, but a controversialist and polemicist against the Catholic sympathizing King Charles I, and became eventually a major player in the Commonwealth government of Oliver Cromwell after the deposition and then execution of the king. At the royal restoration in 1660 of the executed king's son, he was condemned and his writings were burnt. But he went into hiding and survived until a general amnesty was pronounced. When he reemerged, he was jailed briefly for a time, but then released. As this was going on, his personal life was in some turbulence too. He lost 2 wives early on and then had found a happiness with his 3rd wife only in the 1660s. But he was also going slowly blind. And after his time in power, he began the composition of the work that he is best known for, Paradise Lost. But he was completely blind the entire time he wrote it. He began writing it in the waning days of the Commonwealth, when it was increasingly clear that that government would not survive, and moving into the domestic semi-exile he suffered in the Restoration era. He would compose the verses in silence in his mind during the day, and then recite them in the evening aloud for his daughters or for an amanuensis, that is a secretary he had, who would write them down word for word as he gave them verbally to them. He was a rebel himself, and then one who helped to govern, and then saw that rebellion and that government collapse. He was caught in a fierce conflict that rivened England throughout the 17th century between Calvinist Republicans and Catholic monarchists. And he offers a picture of evil that is profoundly Augustinian, but emphasizing, as a Calvinist and a Republican, the individual's responsibility and, by extension, dignity, by focusing on a rebellion gone terribly awry and a leader horribly mutilated by his own revolt. Now, before I go any further, I've used this word Republican a couple times. I really ought to just be very clear and say, when I'm talking about Republican, I'm not talking about a present-day political party. I'm talking about a political thinker of today or any time in roughly the last 5 centuries or so, who believed that the proper shape of a human governance is actually to be one of self-governance by the people who are being governed. Right? A Republican is someone who believes that the people as a whole have to govern themselves, not be governed by a king. Milton's overall work is obsessed with the question of evil. His writings on education, on liberty of speech, his anti-monarch writings, even his arguments about divorce, all revolve around how to avoid or limit our own corruption by evil. His epic poem Paradise Lost, which is deeply learned in Calvinist and Puritan theology, was written, as he says early on in the poem, to justify the ways of God to man, to demonstrate that while the fall was real and evil, he's not trying to whitewash the fall or say it was for a larger good or a necessary thing. He's not an Irenaean theodicist in that sense. Nonetheless, while the fall was real, we still live in a fundamentally good universe, and we must be grateful to the God who governs this universe. This poem provides one of the most powerful and vivid descriptions of the nature of evil, both of the character of temptation and the slow or fast descent into sin and corruption. Milton's vision of the nature of metaphysical evil considered in itself is represented best really in the figure of Satan. And the character of humans, when they come in contact with it, is, of course, the study of what happens with Adam and Eve. Here, I want to look at the representation of the decay of Satan over the course of the poem. And then as well, the corruption but residual nobility of Adam and Eve in the epic's dramatic action, before finally saying some stuff about God as the provident orderer of this poem and of the cosmos. Now, before we do that, though, stop for a second and think about a difficulty that Milton had that Dante did not, and that is the difficulty of writing directly about evil. Dante didn't do that. Dante wrote about an ordinary person, one like us, coming to see evil for what it is. He did not write about evil's self-understanding in itself. Because of the challenge that the structure of his poem sets him, Milton has to write about evil in itself. And to do that, he has to really bend metaphors in complicated ways. Not just in thinking about Satan and Satan's inner life, but even in his descriptions of hell, so that famously Milton describes hell as a kind of darkness visible. More importantly, though, these metaphors he's using rest back on a history of paradoxical metaphors used to think about evil, many of which rely on this very early pattern formulated first in Latin and a practice that enters into Roman Catholic, medieval Christian liturgies, medieval Christian rituals, and then begins to be something that both Roman Catholics and Protestants use, the category of what's called in Latin the felix culpa. I've said this before, the happy fault. If you think about hell as a kind of visible darkness, which is what Milton wants to talk about it as, it's possible also to talk about evil in the context of Christian theology as a happy fault, because it turns out that it's only because the humans fell that Christ comes to save everybody. At least this is the view of much Orthodox Christian theology. So it was of a necessity for humans to fall so that Christ would come, which is a great blessing. That's the argument anyway. Now, the difficulty of talking directly about evil in these ways is far more profound than you might first realize, and much more difficult than it may at first appear. We'll see thinkers later on trying to do this as well, when we talk about evil, not just in realistic philosophical descriptions, but also in literary descriptions in the especially 19th and 20th century. But let's start with Satan now. Now, what exactly is Satan's sin? Pretty early on it's established. It's rebellion against God. But why? What for? How does Satan see the rebellion? In fact, Satan sees the rebellion as prompted by God. He sees himself as tempted by God. As Satan says in the first book, he says, God tempted our attempt and wrought our fall. Right? God made Satan so great that it was easy for Satan, inevitable perhaps, Satan thinks, for him to be tempted. At least that's Satan's idea. So Satan admits he's a rebel, but as with the Islamic accounts of Iblis, and with medievalist scholastics like Anselm and Aquinas, he has an excuse. From his perspective, God was behind his fall. Satan, then, is not really willing to own up to his own responsibility in this. He wants to figure out a way to make it someone else's fault. This, it seems to me, is related to another fact about Satan in the poem. A fact which is interesting for thinking about evil today. Among his many other gifts, Satan is a master of possibilities, of hypotheticals, but never able to settle on any of them. It matters a lot that Satan's first spoken word in the whole poem is if, right? When he first, at the bottom of the pit, they've all fallen to the bottom of the pit and they're laying there, him and the fallen angels, and they're stunned, and he looks over like this and he sees another angel there, and he says, it's Beelzebub, who is another high angel. He says, if thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, right? This wonderful first line of Satan's, which is wonderful both for its content, right? If that's you, but oh, how disastrous your fall has been. And if is the first word. It's a hypothetical. And notice how the hypothetical starts a sentence that doesn't end right away. Right away, Satan stops, he looks at the fallen Beelzebub, and he goes off on another tangent about how fallen Beelzebub is. Somewhere, the if thou beest he, that part of a sentence has an ending part of the sentence, but it hasn't come yet. In fact, it won't come for Milton for very many lines. Satan is a sinuous thinker. He's not just ends up as a serpent, he thinks sinuously. He has a hard time making straight declarative sentences. Typically, they come only at the end of vast, wandering lines, paragraphs that are enormously rhetorically powerful, but when considered outside of the rationalizations that led up to them, can sound enormously dubious. So, for example, Satan says, the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven, right? In other words, here in hell, I can be in heaven. This can be my heaven. Or most famously, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. If we can understand the psychology behind these lines, we will grasp the core of Milton's picture of satanic evil. I guess one question is about whether or not choice itself, freedom, is about having lots of possibilities. Does Satan think he had a choice, or does he think he was set up? He seems to oscillate wildly between two of these things here, these two extremes. When he thinks about his own condition, he blames God. God set me up for this. But when he thinks about his own ambitions, he thinks of himself as doing it himself, as wholly unsponsored. Think about Satan in comparison to Iblis. In Iblis's case, his fall, the fall of Satan in the Islamic text, is caused by Iblis not doing something, by not acting. And again, we've seen that there's at least a semi-reputable ethical or spiritual rationale for Iblis's resistance on some readings of Iblis. But in Satan's case, for Milton, this is not so. Satan's rebellion is clearly wholly self-willed, wholly committed to the idea, more extreme even than Aquinas or Anselm or Dante too, that Satan should be his own God. In a way that Anselm and Aquinas thought wasn't really possible for Satan, Milton says, no, Satan can actually formulate this thought. And Milton tries in his poetry to represent Satan's thinking as he does this. How can Satan do this? What's the motive for Satan's thinking? What is Satan's inner life like? We get some of this when Satan tries to talk to other people, to the other fallen devils, and especially sometimes to, say, Adam and Eve. In fact, Satan's vision of Adam and Eve sees them, in a way, as sort of like the Athenians see the Melians in Thucydides, right? He's looking at them and he sees them and he says, oh, you poor creatures, you are going to suffer for what God has done to me. God's the one who's causing me to cause you to suffer. It's not really your fault. You're caught up in a much larger war between superpowers, myself and God, that treat you like a plaything. Satan thinks he's using the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a bait for them, luring them out. Although, of course, as we'll see in a little while, it's not clear for whom the tree of the knowledge of good and evil turns out to be a bait at all. Now, to himself, at times, Satan seems to describe himself as, or think of himself, not so much describe himself, as think of himself as someone who, as one of the other angels says, rather than be less, he cared not to be at all. This explains the better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. In other words, rather than be at a lower state than he thinks he deserves, he would rather not be at all. Again, Satan in some sense resents the conditions of his own existence. That's one part of Satan's reality. The other part that's complicating this whole story is that Satan can never be sincerely satanic. He can never fully believe the story about himself that he's trying to tell. For he knows and somehow realizes the foundations of his own being, the futility of sin. At the deepest level, Satan represents, in a way, the unavoidability of truth. He frequently breaks down in the poem. He frequently despairs. He's continually paranoid that, in fact, everything is still God's plan. That his fall is God's plan, that the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden is God's plan, that their eventual redemption and elevation to Satan's former spot in heaven's court, by the way. They're going to get his apartment. That's God's plan too. That the whole plan is God's, not Satan's. And that Satan is thus still a bit player in God's drama. And of course, in all this, Satan's paranoia turns out to be right. In fact, the tree, which Satan thought was his bait for Adam and Eve, turns out to be God's bait for Satan. God uses Satan's temptation to pave the way for Christ's redemption and elevation of humanity, as is foreseen and prophesied by the end of the poem. This is the Felix culpa. So Satan is both simultaneously a rebel and a person who knows rebellion is futile. And the amplitude and magnitude of his verbal rebellion and the magnificence of it is paralleled in Milton's representation, by a brilliant representation of Satan as also, behind that verbal pomposity, completely despairing about the futility of this whole exercise. Now, think about Adam and Eve now. In comparison to Satan, Adam and Eve are far more, well, they're relatively simple. They're pretty clueless of sin. They don't really understand what it is. This is not to say that they're stupid or that their state is not to be envied. They are perfected humans. They're strong, lucid, extremely intelligent, emotionally astute, serene. They're simultaneously supermodels, celebrities, and Nobel Prize winners, right? They're basically everything that you and I are not. But one thing that they are that we are not, they are innocent. And that innocence complicates their relationship to the events that unfold within and around them. In fact, Adam is warned, just as in Genesis, in this poem, Adam is warned not to eat of the tree by Raphael, one of the angels. Raphael says to Adam, get a book here. But of the tree which tasted works knowledge of good and evil, thou mayst not eat, that is, you shouldn't eat. In the day thou eatst, thou diest. Death is the penalty imposed. Beware and govern well thy appetite, lest sin surprise thee and her black attendant death. This knowledge that Raphael offers, this warning he gives Adam, who then communicates it as well to Eve, can this be useful for them? It's unclear. As the title of a very famous book about this poem puts it, Adam and Eve are surprised by sin. That is, they are warned about sin, but they cannot quite understand what it is that is the it that they are being warned about. Once again, we come back to the question of the relationship, the very puzzling and mysterious relationship between innocence and experience here. If Adam and Eve had been warned in a way that acquainted them with sin, in a way they would have had to fall into sin to be able to understand what it was. But absent that immediate acquaintance, any kind of warning is going to be finally not all that useful for them. And inevitably, when Adam and Eve do sin, the sin of Eve, who's the first one to sin, right, off on her own, gardening, is more of a matter of careless folly, vanity, and pride than of deliberate, monstrous, satanic evil. Now, of course, part of the lesson here is that careless folly, vanity, and pride are shown to be disastrous. I mean, Milton is not, sanding off the sharp edges here. But more interestingly, Adam's decision to eat the apple along with Eve after she's done it is itself both a sign of his love for her and also a sign of, and in a way, the very event of, the misordering of his own loves. For if he had been properly loving God, he would have eschewed Eve, he would have rejected her at that moment, turned her into God, and she would have died, and God would have given him another wife to start a still perfect human race with. So Eve's frivolous sin is one thing, but Adam, some people think Eve, is blamed for the whole thing here. It's not true. Eve's frivolous sin is one thing, but Adam takes full responsibility because he cannot bear to lose Eve. So this is the difference between satanic and human sin. Satanic sin is often just about itself. Human sin often complicatedly ropes in other people, or we are roped into sin by other people. Adam falls because he falls in love. Adam falls in love in, for, and because of love for Eve. Now, think about God. Does the fall defeat God's plan? Not at all. As Satan suspected, God foreknows this fall and foreknows its certainty of happening. But God does not preordain it, nor does God create Adam and Eve merely as setups, as fall guys, as Milton has God say early on in the poem. God made Adam sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. God knows with certainty that it will happen, and God makes God's plans accordingly in the poem. In fact, God says this in the poem, talking about the reason they cannot blame him. God says, they cannot blame their maker or their making or their fate, as if predestination overruled their will, disposed by absolute decree or high foreknowledge. They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault. Right? I'm not to blame. Which had no less proved certain unforeknown. That is, had I, God, not foreknown this, it still would have happened. Now, there's an important thing that Milton is doing here that's very important to see. You have to understand the difference between God, in the philosophical tradition Milton is coming out of, the difference between God foreknowing something will happen and God commanding that thing happen. The difference is related to God's participation in time from the perspective of eternity. Eternity does not mean a parallel extension of time running alongside the moments of history. That's not how eternity works. Eternity is a single instant of the fullness of time. And in that instant of the fullness of time, all moments of time are equally present to eternity. So in a sense, God in eternity foreknows nothing because everything is known simultaneously in the present for God in eternity. From any perspective of time, God's knowledge of future events in time will look like foreknowledge. But that's only because we are thinking about it from within time itself. From God's eternal present to all moments of time, everything has already happened. So God knows everything before history, even from our perspective, begins. So that's why God can foreknow things without compelling them to happen for Milton. God's eternity allows that knowledge to happen for him. The second thing that God does, or God can say, is not just that God foreknows this, but God will use this fall to create a greater story still, the story of Jesus Christ and redemption. Gabriel points this out. When Adam and Eve and their descendants eventually come to inhabit all the virtues once again, especially love, then they will, he says, possess a paradise within thee, happier far. So Satan's plan is, as ever, vexed and turned against him. Remember again Dante's story here. Remember the overall story of Christianity. However great evil is, however real it is always going to be inframed by a larger and happier narrative. A narrative whose ultimate ending is guaranteed to be happy. It's an interesting fact about Christianity. For Christianity, the end of the world is already in some important way scripted, right? In the book of Revelations. And therefore, Christians always are convinced of a happy ending to the world, at least for them. Now, let's try to bring together some of these themes. For Milton, human evil is a kind of folly, radically absurd, but it's also a kind of satanic rebellion, which is far more dramatic and dark than we might initially think. But it also is ultimately futile, again, a matter of folly. But God is able to use human evil, and even for Milton, satanic evil, as a device for the improvement of the world, and potentially as a strategy for human maturation. Now, many have wondered over time, over centuries, whether Milton's representation of Satan is in some ways too powerful, too vivid, too seductive. The vision of him in his psychic agony, the tortured nature of his motives, and his self-torture at his destiny, his knowledge and his paranoia of what God is doing, all conspire to present a remarkably seductive picture of evil. Vivid, vigorous, terrifically driven. Satan looks to be the most lively of fictional characters. In contrast, many people have found God, God's Son, Christ, the good angels, and even Adam and Eve, wan, pale, tepid, particularly by comparison to Satan. Some have even suggested that this was perhaps a deliberate plan of Milton's. That in fact Satan turns out to be the most interesting and lively figure, not just in Paradise Lost, but in English literature altogether, and Satan appears so purposefully. Indeed, the late 18th century poet and philosophical prophet of sorts, pretty amazing guy, William Blake, famously wrote that the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, that is, Milton wrote in chains when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, right? He wrote with his full powers unrestrained when he's talking about the devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. This is an astonishing claim, right? That in fact, two different ways. True poets have to be of the devil's party in some sense. This is part of what is being suggested here. Because they are creating. And to be a creator is to be a rival to God. And that's what the devil most basically is. On this charge, anyway. But I actually think that's wrong. I think Milton knew very well what he was on about. I think his depiction of evil in its purest satanic form is not in fact an elevation of Satan, except in the sense that a specimen is raised up to us so that we may look at it more closely. And when one considers the motives and rationales of Satan and Adam, if there is any tragedy in the poem, it lies in Adam's choice for Eve, not in Satan's choice of himself. And this explains a bit, I think, the rebel Milton's decision to write an epic where the rebellion was satanic. He had to figure out why he could say sincerely that the English Civil War was not, in fact, a satanic conspiracy, because many people thought it was. In the composition of Paradise Lost, Milton manages to make that claim. But more than that, he manages to present what still remains, I think, the unrivaled imaginative representation of probably the full range of human experience that English literature has yet produced. Next, we'll see the context of another setting, another world, in thinking about good and evil. One that is complicatedly related to Milton's, but also in some important ways very different. And that is the world of the late 17th and early 18th century Enlightenment.